So remember in my last video when I said how out of all the animals to star in cheesy monster movies, sharks were number 1, crocodiles were second, and snakes were third? Well, we already took care of the most popular snake movie, and sharks? I don't know if I'm ready to cover the mountain of shark movies just yet, so what's next? It's actually rather appropriate that I review this movie immediately after Anaconda, as the two are kind of inseparable in my mind. To be fair, I'm not the only one, as several other YouTubers seem to have a similar can't do one without the other attitude towards these two properties. It also helps that the two actually share a fair amount of similarities. They're both late 90s creature features in which the main animal star in question is one that many people are already afraid of. It has an all-star cast, a relatively large budget, at least for a movie like this, and was a box office success, even if critical reception wasn't as kind. Though at least Anaconda got a thumbs up from Roger Ebert. This movie, on the other hand, ended up being on his worst films of the year list, though this was after Siskel died, so maybe he was just in a bad mood. But hey, the RT score is higher, for whatever that's worth, which is next to nothing. Yeah, so while all signs point to this being a stinker, I think most people can agree that critical reception and what the aggregates say isn't always the best indication of whether or not you're going to enjoy a movie like this. Any gorehounds and creature feature enthusiasts, like myself, know what we're here for. We want to see a big-ass crocodile eating people up. So do we get that? Well, the movie starts with a fish and game officer scuba diving in the fictional Black Lake in Maine. Yep, this movie doesn't even take place in the actual Lake Placid. Anyway, he's accompanied by the local sheriff, who immediately disapproves of the diver's supposed sarcasm, and if that's enough to get him irritated, then he is in for one rough movie. Everything is proceeding as normal at first, but it doesn't take long for the Jaws-inspired POV to rear its ugly head, which most of you are aware means this guy is in deep shit. Sure enough, the POV camera comes up and bites him in the ass. Just straight for the ass. Speaking of ass, the sheriff is initially oblivious to the diver's distress because he's too busy sitting on his fat ass eating Twinkies. Luckily, the crocodile is considerate to help out the poor guy by dragging him closer to the boat. Unfortunately, he doesn't exactly know when to let go of his new chew toy, and like so many unfortunate chew toys before him, the diver is torn in two. Shockingly, the diver actually manages to cling to life for a few seconds after being bit in half, which just sounds terrifying to me, before eventually succumbing. This whole opening scene is actually pretty effective. It borrows heavily from the opening of Jaws, yes, but seeing a man violently bitten in two only 7 minutes in is a surefire way to get an audience's attention. Unfortunately, said attention is soon pissed away when we transition over to New York City and are introduced to one of our unfortunate main characters, Kelly Scott, played by Bridget Fonda. She's upset because her boyfriend, Kevin, played by an uncredited Adam Arkin, dumped her. And while you're just as riveted by that as I am, we, unfortunately, cut back to Maine to be introduced to one of our other main characters, Fish and Game Officer Jack Wells, played by Bill Pullman. The sheriff fills them in on what happened, but since they're in Maine, they don't immediately suspect a crocodile. But that's okay, because Kelly's on the case, and she is...
You got a thing against museums? What, are we all museum bigots in Maine? Could you be a little more condescending? Because I'm not real great with subtlety.
annoying as balls for the first third of this movie. We'll get to that later. For now, she's just getting over Kevin having cheated on her with her coworker, and is very opposed to traveling to Maine.
I'm not going to Maine. It's ridiculous.
Oh gee, I bet that means she's really not going and this isn't the most obvious setup to a joke we've already heard a million times. Oh, what? Yes, as Kelly is the only one here with any modicum of scientific expertise, she's unfortunately needed for the investigation. She's able to deduce that the tooth is indeed reptilian, but is not prehistoric, and feels she needs to go to the lake itself to gain any more information and...
If you call me ma'am one more time, I'll sue you, and with today's laws, it's possible.
Oh God, shut up. We're less than 15 minutes in and I still don't want to believe this is going to be one of our main characters. So the trio head out on the water, with the sheriff striking a pose that makes him look eerily like Donald Trump, which is made extra funny when you realize this actor went on to play Trump. Well, I can't say it's not ideal casting. While out on the water, they pay a visit to the only known resident of the lake, a seemingly friendly old lady, Dolores Bickerman, played by Betty White, who is hands down the best character in the movie. She quite humorously explains how she supposedly killed her husband, which of course the trio doubt, but that's not important because we need more scenes of Kelly being annoying. This time it's about how she doesn't want to sleep in a tent. Ugh, can something please come along and interrupt this oh, hey, look at Moosehead. Wait a minute. A Moosehead in a lake in Maine? Nobody's gonna get that.
Hey. You threw it at me!
I just let go of it.
You threw it at me! Did you see that?
Okay, you know what? I don't care if this movie came out before this term came into widespread circulation. By my metric, this bitch right here is a certified... You know him when you hear him. Some more bickering between Wells and Scott before we're finally introduced to the last member of our quartet of doofuses, Hector Sear, played by Oliver Platt. He's a mythology professor who is fully committed to the notion that there is a crocodile in these waters, and is hell-bent on finding it. He's also...
You're fat.
Yeah. So as you've probably been able to pick up on, while plenty of cheesy monster movies provide moments of unintentional hilarity as their main source of humor, Lake Placid does not. Lake Placid is a straight-up horror comedy, and as I have hopefully so far illustrated, and will continue to illustrate, its success in either area is highly debatable, but especially the latter. A lot of the humor basically boils down to, haha, grown adults acting like children, ha, fat guy is fat, haha, they said fuck. I was half expecting a fart joke by the end of this movie. It didn't happen, but if it did, it might have ended up being the funniest joke in the movie. Getting back to the story, after Hector introduces himself, the foursome go out canoeing, with Hector picking up something on his radar. But that's not as important as these riveting character interactions, like Hector talking about a likely fabricated story of how he and Scott had sex, and him calling the sheriff fat. Oh, that scamp. Finally, the Crocs had enough of this and flips over Kelly in the sheriff's canoe, and with the Croc coming up from under them, we of course immediately cut away like nothing happened. Oh, but of course, we wouldn't want this movie to run too long. I mean, it is already a monstrous 82 minutes, so we gotta make cuts where we can. Later that night, the sheriff sees two of his deputies who are paid off by Hector to go dig a trap and gets really mad and crashes a party being held in one of the tents, and all before Hector can have sexy time with the female deputy. Oh no! Yeah, this seems pretty pointless, and there was hardly even a reason to mention it, but I did anyway. Whatever, we all make mistakes. Next scene, some dumbass, quasi-romantic scene between Kelly and Jack. Okay, next scene. Sheriff leaves his tent to go take a piss, runs into Hector, who complains about his small cock. Boy, really making the most of their short runtime, aren't they? Though I will admit, seeing the sheriff accidentally fall into one of Hector's traps was kind of funny, and actually gives some purpose to that scene from earlier, so score one for you, Lake Placid. The next day, they're back out on the water, with Hector playing the recorded sounds of crocodile hatchlings to draw the beast out, and him and Jack diving into the water because, I don't know, they have a death wish. Well, Hector actually kind of does, so, While down there, they do get a glimpse of the croc, but it isn't long before it gets a hold of the boat and starts dragging it around, knocking Kelly into the water in the process. They manage to get back on board, just as Jack and Hector resurface, but when one of the sheriff's deputies pulls up the speaker, he... gets ahead of himself. After the body's taken away, Hector and the sheriff get into another argument, which ends with the sheriff getting caught in another one of Hector's traps. They, of course, let him down after he promises not to injure Hector once he gets free, but uh-oh, what's that they say about not making promises you can't keep?
Alright, it's over. It's over. Remember, you promised not to hurt him, so I lied.
The sheriff does actually seem intent on just beating Hector with a stick, so really it's lucky for him that a random grizzly bear just appeared out of nowhere and... Wait a minute, grizzly bear? Well, I guess that's another miracle of nature. Somehow a grizzly bear managed to migrate all the way from the Pacific Northwest to New England. But it's not long before this miracle of nature is overshadowed by another miracle of nature, as the crocodile finally makes its grand entrance, appearing out of the water to chomp down on the bear. And I'm not gonna lie, that was pretty awesome. Of course, they debate over whether or not to just blow it up, which leads to Hector egging on the sheriff by saying he's a brown belt in karate. Thankfully, he ends up getting the deserved response. The next morning, the group's out croc hunting again, and this time managed to locate a footprint, as well as the head of the guy the croc killed. While that's going on, Hector and the lady deputy from earlier go out in Hector's helicopter to find the crocodile so he can... swim with it? he doesn't really have a good reason to do it. And I mean, in universe, he's just completely crazy. He just wanted to swim with the crocodile. Wouldn't you? But that's not as interesting as what's going on with our other group, as they see Miss Dolores Bickerman again, feeding one of her cows to the crocodile. Naturally, the sheriff is a bit upset with how she's just been nonchalantly feeding the croc for years now and never said anything about it, prompting Betty White to deliver the line of the movie.
If I had a dick, this is where I'd tell you to suck it.
Then we get back to these two dummies, well, at least the deputy is trying to talk Hector out of his swim with the croc, meaning she has more integrity than I, since I probably would have just let him do it and then deal with the consequences. Those consequences soon appear in the form of a giant crocodile. Fortunately, Hector's got a foolproof plan. By releasing his life raft at just the right time, he thinks the crocodile will go for that instead of the helicopter. He tries it, and it works, for a bit, as the croc lunges out and grabs a hold of the chopper. Quite a perilous situation. I wonder how they're gonna get out of this. The deputy shoots it a couple times and they're free. Well, that was a thrilling 10 seconds of excitement. Let's get back to bickering! Hector doesn't want to see the crocodile killed. He believes it's a miracle of nature, something to be studied. He proposes this idea to Jack and the sheriff, saying they can lure him on land and then pump him full of drugs, and if anything goes wrong, they'll still have the sheriff's big gun to deal with it. Well, that's all well and good, but how are you gonna lure him in? Well, that's one way to do it. Having a cow dangling from a helicopter. I gotta admit that's actually pretty amusing. Though, naturally, Dolores isn't too happy about this.
I'm rooting for the crocodile. I hope he swallows your friends whole.
Thanks for the summary of the movie, Betty. By nightfall, they still haven't got anything. Until suddenly, something comes up on the radar, and, you know, all throughout the movie we've been seeing nothing but these morons bickering with one another, and it's really only here in the final act that they actually start cooperating with one another. And, coincidentally, this is where the film finally starts picking up. It's almost like watching characters actually working together effectively and not pointlessly arguing isn't something that no one wants to see. Anyway, they spot the crocodile. It's coming. It leaps out of the water, causing Hector's chopper to inexplicably crash. I don't know, maybe he just wanted to take a dip. The sheriff also takes a dip when the croc surprises him before coming ashore and engaging in a brief truck chase that ends with it knocking Kelly into the water. It chases her into the water as she's trying to swim to Hector's chopper, and we get a halfway decent underwater chase scene before the crocodile bursts his head through the doors of the chopper and gets stuck, taking all the fight out of him. Jack puts one last dart in him for good measure, and that pretty much does it. Then another crocodile appears. Yep, just out of nowhere, another crocodile appears. It chomps on Hector's leg a bit, and then the sheriff blows it up. What was the point of that? What, did the writer get bored and just scribble that part in crayon and then it actually made in the movie? What was that? Well, aside from that pointlessness, Florida Fish and Game arrives soon after to take the crocodile away. The surviving crocodile, that is. I don't think they'll have much use for the other one. And, I don't know, something about the image of a giant croc having its mouth bound with tape the same way we do it with regular crocodilians, I do find rather entertaining. But on top of all of that, we get the most important confirmation. The cow survived. The characters say their awkward goodbyes, the crocodile is taken away to a secure location, and we get an ending scene that will serve as the basis for not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 shitty direct-to-video sequels. One of them being a crossover with the Anaconda series. Oh, goody. Lake Placid is not an awful movie, but in some ways I am a little disappointed by it. A large amount of the blame can be placed on the humor, which, as this film is a horror comedy, is kind of an important element, and most of the time it falls flat. Now, I'm by no means a comedic genius, nor do I have a super highbrow sense of humor, but the jokes in this movie are so bare bones and juvenile that even I couldn't find humor in a lot of them. Now, some of the comedy works, mostly from Betty White, who's also easily the most entertaining human character, which is why it's a shame she's only in it for a few minutes, but most of it, especially from Oliver Platt, is just stupid. And not the fun kind of stupid either, just the stupid kind. Now, human characters are rarely the true stars of monster and creature movies, but the lowest they tend to sink to is forgettably bland, and granted, some of the characters here fit that mold quite nicely. Especially Jack, who's just completely paper thin. He's supposed to be the leading man, but there's just absolutely nothing to him beyond that. He's just Guy. Put it all together, and you have me wholeheartedly agreeing with White's sentiment. Speaking of which, remember what I said at the beginning? I mean, surely if there's any area where this film can shine, it's in seeing a giant crocodile in action, wreaking havoc. And I did get that, but really not that much. To start with, I can at least say the crocs look good. As was standard procedure in the mid to late 90s, these crocs were brought to life using a mix of practical animatronics and CGI animation, and both worked great. It's no surprise though, as the practical animatronics were handled by none other than Stan Winston, who most of you should know by now, but in case you don't, Aliens, Terminator, Jurassic Park, need I go on? While the CG work was handled by Digital Domain, who prior to Lake Placid did work on such films as True Lies, Titanic, Armageddon, Apollo 13, and would go on to do, a bunch of stuff, but that's not the point. The point is, top tier VFX house. They do good work here. Same with Winston and his team, of course, but their creations aren't given much interesting to do. The crocs don't get a lot of screen time, which I'm okay with since limited screen time is pretty much par for the course for these types of movies, but I'm saying even when they do show up, they don't really do a whole lot. I mean, not that this is the only factor, but I counted, and there were only 2 human deaths in the entire movie. That's right, the crocs only killed 2 people, and they weren't even important characters. They were just randos who died in the very same scene they were introduced in. Only in the finale do we really get something from them, and even then, that second crocodile appearing out of nowhere is still just random as hell. All this isn't to say that Lake Placid is completely worthless. Even though they don't do much throughout the movie, the crocodiles are still brought to life incredibly well, and I mean, from a filmmaking point of view, I can't really say there's anything awful here. The biggest thing dragging Lake Placid down for me is its script, and unfortunately, that's kind of a big problem. I guess maybe I just expected a little bit more from the most famous killer crocodile movie, which I'm now realizing may have been a lapse of judgment on my part. But you know what? It's not the worst movie out there. I'm sure a more forgiving soul than I could find value in such a picture, so who am I to take that away from them? I don't know, but in any event, that does it for this video. See ya!